for being here. We appreciated your presentation. Next up, we have the, forgive me if I pronounce this wrong, I'm going to try, Mi'kma'wil Tlupakin, very difficult, MTI, appearing Steve Ginnish, Director of Forestry and Natural Resources. You may assume the presenter's chair. Mr. Ginnish, you'll have 20 minutes for your presentation. At the 5-minute mark, I'll hold my hand up like this. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. If not, I'll wait till you get a breath in and I'll use the microphone. At the end of 20 minutes, you'll receive 40 minutes of questioning from all 4 political parties, 10 minutes from each party if they so choose to use it all. We appreciate you being here today and we look forward to the presentation. The floor is yours.
Well, Ali and Maxi, thank you, Mr. Chair. Nidalawan is Stephen Ginnish, Egian. For those who cannot speak my language, I just introduce myself as my name is Stephen Ginnish. I am a member of the Nugawaganek Eelground First Nation. I'm Director of Forestry and Natural Resources, Mi'kma'wil Taplutahan Inc., or MTI. Mi'kma'wil Taplutahan means Micmac People's Law, or how we govern ourselves. We are a non-profit organization whose members are the 9 Mi'kmaq communities in New Brunswick, and we represent 8 of the 9 Mi'kmaq communities on consultation matters in what is present day called New Brunswick.
Excuse me. Need the mic here. To the presenter, I have to ask you to wear your mask. We still have the rule in the anywhere in the Legislative Assembly, including the chamber. Sorry about that, but I had to remind you.
No. Sorry about that, Chair. No one informed me I had to keep it on. It's just that it's hard for me to speak through this. I fog up bad and I can't see my notes. And I'm sure we all have that problem. Yes. I do have both of my vaccinations and everything, so if everybody wants to see safe. So anyway, when we normally sit down and introduce ourselves in any group, we normally recognize the territory we're sitting in. And of course, we're in the Wolastoqiyik territory, which is part of the Wabanaki Confederacy. 4 tribes are part of the Wabanaki Confederacy. Of course, is the Maliseet First Nations, the Mi'kmaq First Nations, the Passamaquoddy First Nations, and of course, one that the province of New Brunswick truly seemed to have forgotten is the Penobscots. I received my education from UNB, UBC, and NBCC. I'm a recipient of the Canadian Forest Service Merit Award in 2006 and held the position of Natural Resource Director for Eelground First Nation from 1992 to 2012. During that time, I brought Forest Stewardship Council FSC certification 2005 to 2010 to the community of Eelground, a first for any forestry operation in Canada, Indigenous or otherwise. In 1998, I was presented with the James N. Kitts Award from the Canadian Institution of Forestry for my individual contributions made to sustainable resource management, and the Milton F. Gregg Award from the Conservation Council, along with the Gaylor Award for Sustainable Business Development Initiative and Environment Protection. I received both of those in 1999. Within MTI, I brought forth collectively with the MTI team substantial changes on how the peat industry, Department of Transportation, Department of Local Environment and Local Government, addressing concerns and issues related to major infrastructure and resource development projects. We were not initially invited to participate in these hearings, but felt it was important and necessary for you to hear an Indigenous perspective. So we asked to be added to the witness list. We have had about a day to prepare. So this is not a comprehensive presentation, but will outline some necessary background, observations, and recommendations you should consider in your deliberations. I'm always available to discuss this in more detail with any member who may have expressed interest afterwards. I'm first going to talk about basic backgrounds on treaty rights. New Brunswick is an unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq Wolastoq, and the Passamaquoddy people, historically known as the Wabanaki Confederacy. So when we talk about Wabanaki, or we talk about forest or the natural environment, it's the Wabanaki forest. It's not the Acadian forest. It's the Wabanaki forest. The Mi'kmaq are signatories to covenant change of peace and friendship treaties which were signed with the British Crown. The peace and friendship treaties are not treaties of surrender. Our ancestors negotiated treaties in which they were promised they would be allowed to continue to hunt, fish, and gather as we have for thousands of years, and to trade in these goods. Signing these agreements were intended to bring peaceful relationships between our peoples and yours. The intent was to share the resources and to share in stewardship on the land. Unfortunately, this has not been the case. The Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq has established Aboriginal and treaty rights under Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution Act 1992 and have been upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada. We have Aboriginal title throughout the land and waters of this territory. This includes all of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, as well as parts of Quebec, Maine, and Newfoundland. And if you look at those boundary lines are pretty well what present-day society would delineate as the Acadia forest. It's the Wabanaki forest. Natural resources are an integral part of traditional lands and waters of the Mi'kmaq and Wolastoq people. We may use them, but we are also their custodians. Natural resources are not simply here for the taking. Rather, they must be managed carefully so as to provide benefits today while guaranteeing the rights and needs of generations yet to come. On the side of consultation and forest management with the province, we have been trying to work with successive governments on how to improve decision-making processes around forestry and natural resources. We strongly believe Indigenous communities need to be involved at the beginning of any decision-making process. This is a key. Another key component of this process involves the development of a provincial-wide Indigenous knowledge study. We presented the province of New Brunswick with a proposal and budget way back in 2017. A provincial-wide IK study would actually help inform government and proponents on the areas that are significant for our communities and insist in land use planning around forestry and natural resources. We have never formally received a response to that proposal. When it comes to forest management plans, we have long expressed our concerns in the development. Our communities has often become an afterthought. We have long argued the more consideration is given to industry when it comes to forest management than to the actual health of the forest. Concerns about deforestation or by insects and pests like the spruce budworm is nothing compared how the forestries are harvested as far as we see it. We are using the land and water in this province to exercise our rights and hunt and gather. Spraying is used. Spraying of these certain sprays have directly affected our medicines, food supply, and therefore the health of our community members. Now on the topic of spraying. We have expressed concerns over the use of herbicides and glyphosate spraying in this province. Not only does the spraying affect the lands, but we know that aerial spraying and runoff also affects the water. In recent years, glyphosate use in forest management has become a concern by many citizens of New Brunswick, and of course our environmental groups such as Stop Spraying and of course the Conservation Council of New Brunswick. Both groups have advocated for the discontinuation of this practice. For the Mi'kmaq, we strive to protect our traditional foods, medicine, plants, and animals. We have raised concerns on its uses and also the presence of heavy metals and cadmium found in the hearts and liver of moose. Not too far in the past, these organs, hearts and liver of the moose, were considered a delicacy for the Mi'kmaq. Today, our communities are fearful of eating these once highly sought-after food items due to the contamination of heavy metals and possible uses of herbicides and pesticides. We admit Mi'kmaq, the Blutigan community members have little scientific understanding about herbicides, insecticides, pesticides, biological agents, heavy metal, and other contaminants being used in land management practices. However, we do not or have not been given the equal opportunity in order to work with science or develop third-party independent systems to justify the use of these agents within our traditional territory. We are really engaged from the forefront, nor do we receive adequate funding to effectively participate. Mi'kmaq Indigenous knowledge does, however, understand the importance of maintaining balance between all beings of Mother, the Earth. We all turn to science to find the answer. However, it was science that brought forth past herbicides like DDT and Agent Orange worldwide to push to ban glyphosate happens, which is happening, which is no different than how these two herbicides I mentioned above went. Does anyone really know where glyphosate was first discovered and used? And I'm sure we all know around this table, but does the public know as a whole that glyphosate was first discovered as a descaler to remove calcium in heavy water deposits from boilers within the industry? And it was accidentally dumped in a field where it killed all the grass, and all of a sudden a year later it was patented as a herbicide. We're also concerned with the potential of conflict of interest by the funders of glyphosate research by industry. The Yellow Machine is a known advocate of the New Brunswick glyphosate spray program. To date, most of the research being carried out on Mi'kmaq land in New Brunswick has not been in collaboration with the Mi'kmaq. Indeed, this lack of collaboration that inclusive of industry as a primary contributor funder is a cause of skepticism towards the result, as the Yellow Machine is a benefactor of the outcome. Mi'kmaq Tabluktahun seeks to work with an unbiased third-party team of expert scientists to carry out literary reviews followed by land research to gain a better understanding of the effects of not only glyphosate, but also BDK and other introduced poisons on our traditional foods, medicine, wildlife, and ultimately our culture and way of life. The Mi'kmaq has extensive and intensive knowledge of our traditional lands on the effects of activities on this land, includes the impact to the ecosystem and its wildlife. The Mi'kmaq of New Brunswick are unwilling to continue standing aside and be expected to accept only what we are told about our environment, about our ecosystem, and the health of our land called Mi'kma'ki. We have great concerns about the continuation of our culture under current circumstances because our culture is so intricately tied to the health of our land and the animals and the plant we rely on for substance. Our recommendations: have the funding available for the province for a provincial-wide ICI study. This will help show traditional land use of the Indigenous people in New Brunswick. We say this simply because of the fact the scientific data that we so depend on as individual, as society, is a result of grants, government funding, research money, all sources of funding, so the various institutions and the various doctors and scholars out there can do the research and do the data collection for us. We don't get that right. We don't get access to that type of resources, and it's our land. A meaningful consultation process where Indigenous people are involved in the forefront. This would include consulting on spraying activities in New Brunswick. Fund a study that would show if the spraying of herbicides use in New Brunswick impacts our food and water supplies. We've been attempting to do that through the federal government and through DERD. Because our elders have been asking us, is our moose safe? Can we still eat our moose? Is our salmon safe? Because they have read studies, they'll see reports that show glyphosate can disseminate in water courses up to 15 kilometers away from spray areas. One of the things that really baffle us is industry forestry operations are not subjected to an environment impact assessment. And even though we have issues under the environment impact assessment process, because it's 1970 language, it needs to be updated and revised. Since all other resource users and takers have to do EIAs. But the biggest consumer of our natural resources within our forestry are excluded from EIAs. Why? We can't understand that. I thank you for listening to me today and welcome any questions you may have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for your presentation. We'll have 40 minutes of questions now, starting with the official opposition. Who is it?
I
MLA Landry.
don't have any specific question. I just want to thank you for being here and being part of this consultation, presenting at the committee, and I certainly took some notes and well heard. Your message is well heard. Thank you.
Well, Ali and McSee, thank you.
MLA LeBlanc.
I'll have just for short questions and I'll pass it over. Thank you for your presentation. My first question would be, how much funding would be that you recommended about being funded for study and research that you would request?
Personally, I do not have that number right in my head, but since I'm the Forestry Natural Resource Director, but within MTI, we have an IK department. And at that time, in 2017, I believe MTI approached the government of New Brunswick through the Department of Aboriginal Affairs now, and it used to be called Aboriginal Secretariat back then because it wasn't a ministerial office, it was just a secretariat. And at that time, I believe it was between 3.5 and 5 million to do a provincial-wide IK study. Now, to add to that, because we never received an official response on where that stood, we seeked out partners. We seeked out industry, those willing partners who were willing to work with our First Nations and our organizations to carry out Indigenous knowledge studies on their project development areas. And I'll single out the peat industry right now because they have been very receptive to that process. The New Brunswick Peat Moss Association has endorsed pretty well any IK study work we asked them to do. Now, provincially, MTI has done an IK study on the East Coast Pipeline that was proposed a few years back. And that study produced a lot of information pertaining to land use. Because you always hear the word traditional or historical use. We still, present day, use the land. We use it a lot more than society thinks. Because of government policies and the systematic dismantling of a culture, we had to go underground to practice our ways. Because if we did them openly within our communities or within the culture, we were charged, we were taken to jail. There's a case that came out of my own community, out of Eel Ground, in 1975. That's not that far away, where I legally could not go out and snare a rabbit because I was hungry. That became a court case. It was called the Gray case in 1975 for a First Nation person to legally trap a beaver on the reservation. That's how bad it was. And people don't know that history. But You see current events that are happening now. Our ancestors, and this hurts me, our ancestors, when they were brought into this world as babies, they're making their voice heard now. And I hope this world wakes up. The greatest country in the world, as it's portrayed around the world. Well, some dirty closet secrets are coming out now.
Thank you. I'll defer my questions to my colleague. Thank you.
No further questions from the, okay, Mr. Kuhn, go
Well, I
ahead.
hope I get all their time as well.
David, how you doing?
Good afternoon, Mr. Ginnish. Thank you for being here. And it's hard seeing you here for some reason.
Pardon, David?
It's difficult seeing you here, Mr.
Ask me
Ginnish,
anything,
today.
David.
I
You
know.
know what I'm like.
I want to start with acknowledging the hurt and pain of the unmarked grave discoveries in
Thank you.
BC,
Allow me.
Saskatchewan.
What's sad about that, and I'm only making a brief comment on this. What's sad about that, we live in the greatest country in the world, and if this country just followed its own laws, it would astonish First Nations simply because of the fact if any unmarked grave is found in this country, it's first treated as a homicide or criminal aspect because there's no statute of limitation on such incidents. And, you know, it's amazing why the country won't pursue it in that manner until proven otherwise. We know the history. We know the history of First Nations and colonialism in the country. But yet, it just saddens me that poor children, you know, if you don't like, if this country don't like who I am as a Mi'kmaq person, come and attack me as an adult. Leave the babies and leave the children alone in any society. It's really hard to come here and speak today because of that, because that's on the back of my mind all the time. Because I experienced it with respect to loss of young life. And so it hurts when you see this all happening and done in such a manner that just disgusts me to say I'm part of this country, to be honest with you.
That's why
So
last
sorry
night
about
in Fredericton, it was so remarkable. The chief of the Wolastoqey Grand Council and elders and grandmothers held some ceremonies and invited members of the non-Indigenous community, even now, to participate.
Yes, the good thing about it, you see the good in all people, regardless of past activities. You see the good in all people, regardless of their background, and that's good to see. And it does show what our elders, what we've been saying under the Truth and Requisition report, what we've been saying on a lot of the reports. And you know, New Brunswick did a lot of reports too, and they're sitting collecting dust. But a lot of the stuff we have said has been the truth. And you know, the truth always prevails. It takes time sometimes to understand why things happen the way they happen. But I hope that the good people of this country, the good people within the legislation system, the good people within the government, within industry and all that, realize that it's time to, you know, learn from the past, move forward from the past, and let's make things better for what I would like to say before I leave this earth, that this is the greatest country in the world. This is one of the greatest provinces. I hope we get to that point where we can say that again. But right now, First Nations, I don't think will.
So one of the last parts of the ceremonies last night was to feed everyone with a little bit of blueberry, or bearberry, as it's called sometimes. And it made me think of today about what we're talking about. And I'd ask the federal regulators whether they look at the impacts of berries absorbing glyphosate on animals that eat it, or other people who eat that as wild food. And they don't actually look at that. They look at livestock and see whether it has an impact, but not on wild species. So that was interesting. And it also made me think about the impacts on wild foods, but also on medicines, as you mentioned. And certainly I have no idea what kind of impact on medicines is happening, but we know that they all have their own habitats, and we know that those habitats are significantly changing as a result of the forest management model that's been applied in New Brunswick for some time. So let me ask you this. We're talking about glyphosate spraying on Crown lands, and yet those lands were never ceded or conquered in any way and are governed by the treaties that were signed. So it seems to me First Nations should be part of the management process directly in terms of decision making. It only makes logical sense. So where are those discussions with New Brunswick about, I don't know whether it's a co-management arrangement or where are those discussions at in terms of First Nations taking their rightful role in helping to oversee the management of what happens on what we call the Crown lands?
Well, David, you asked a loaded question there. Where do I start? I'll go to the berries and the concerns around medicinal plants and roots and stuff like that. You know, like I said in this presentation, Mi'kmaq will tell, we're not scientists. We don't have access to the scientific world as Western science does. And when we ask questions about from the research people out there, we respect them simply because they earn that right for the respect. But then we find out they're funded, or part of their funding is coming from the industry or the sector of the forest management system that is a benefactor. And we can't understand that. To us, that's a total conflict of interest. And I have a good relationship with Dr. Kevin Percy, who worked with First Nations out west on blueberry fields and the effect of the oil sands. And they found the closer to the oil sand development, the more contaminants were present in berries or present on berries, like the dust, and the dust would, you know, crumble everything up. And so the berries were not harvestable, or they would not reach full growth. They'd be all crumpled or dried out because there'd be a dust layer on top of them that would act like a greenhouse and just ruin the berry. I tried to, like I said, we only had a day and a half to prepare this, and I recall reading a study there the other day maybe about a week ago, and for some reason I can't locate it. I don't know who did it, but it came from out west. And the study was related to the staying power or the half-life or the amount of time glyphosate stays in the environment. And of course it relates to a lot of contributing factors around weather conditions, hot versus rain condition, moist, and everything. And at the end of that study, they recommended within the glyphosate spray area, do not eat the berries, blueberries. That the spray was present a lot longer than what was originally anticipated. The half-life was 28 days versus 14 days or something like that. But what was astonishing, the amount of glyphosate that stayed in the root systems of various plants were up to 12 months. And it's just preliminary research. But this is what First Nations are asking. First Nations are asking to carry out studies within their organizations with the scientists, third-party interest. And we have identified people within the University of Guelph, for instance. One of the fellows that were going to be involved in that moose, the health of our moose meat back there in 2019, which we still never got any word or reply from, and we're only asking for that time for our $100,000 to do that study. And it would have brought in 3 key researchers. It would have brought in Dr. Ryan Poser from the University of Guelph, who, if anybody's talking about glyphosate, is a renowned glyphosate research expert that works with glyphosate in aquatics, like water environments. But he was very willing to work with us with respect to sampling moose that was harvested by our people in samples of the moose collected from Evilvabar First Nation right down to Dorchester. We're asking our hunters and our harvesters to let us know when you harvested a moose in your community, and we would go down and take a brain sample and a liver sample along with a muscle sample. And we were in contact, direct contact and partnership with Dr. Christopher Edge up here at Natural Resource Canada in order to make sure all the logistics and all the aspects of collecting that sample was done as soon as the moose was harvested and preserved for best results. We still haven't got word on that proposal, and that was 3 years after we'd done it. Now, my hats, I do contribute a little bit of this to the, Department of Energy and Natural Resources, because at least they were going to provide us with the glyphosate spray maps so we can correlate where the moose was harvested. Is it close to an area that was recently sprayed? We can make that correlation. But our elders are so concerned about their food. We're already susceptible to so many introduced diseases and infections in our community. Diabetes is rampant in our community simply because the change of our diet from, being of a hunter-gatherer type society versus corralled like cattle on reservations and force-fed. Because that's how we see reservations. Like society as a whole looks at reservations today because they don't understand the history as our original communities. No. That was the last step. Even before Canada was formed, is when you had New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Upper and Lower Canada, was to get control. Even though we had treaties, get control, get the Indians corralled, get them in their reservations so we can keep whittling out their land. And we're dealing with so much contamination, it's unbelievable. Right now, like Eel Ground, for instance, the community I come from, even the original set-aside for that reservation was just belittled by the Europeans. The Davidson Grant, which gave a lumber tycoon at the time in Eel Ground, historically, a large tract of where the former repat mill is sitting now. Well, the Eel Ground First Nation finally just got recognition concerning that claim. But who wants that contaminated land? Who? Who in their right mind will take that big piece of contaminated land? But now, and we said this, First Nations always said this, industry will come and go, but who is left with the mess to clean up? And this worries about our traditional lands.
All right, thank you. Next up, Ms. Conroy.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Ginnish. We've had a lot of Miramichiers today. That was it's nice to see. I too want to thank you for being here and acknowledge the hurt and the pain that you and your people are feeling right now with this devastating news that we hear yet again. And hopefully all of Canadians are feeling as we share the grief with you. And like you say, I hope people are starting to wake up and see the history and not so far history. That this is, it's not so far back that it really makes us think about it. So I thank you for that and I acknowledge you. I just have a couple of questions for you. The First Nations community is actively involved in forestry and the operations in the province. How successful do you think that is for the First Nations in this day and age, I guess?
Yeah. You say actively involved. I kind of disagree with that word actively. Currently, the First Nations, as a result of the Thomas Peter Paul case of 1999, were granted interim access agreements of 5% to harvest on what the province refers to as Crown land, but to harvest on our own Mi'kmaq territory. The key word is interim. There were interim agreements then, there are still interim agreements today. They're based on per capita, the population of communities. So a lot of First Nation communities, the allocation ain't worth nothing because economically you can't do nothing with them, they're too small. But yet you have neighboring contractors that would have 200,000 cubic meters allocation of fiber and 10 harvesters employ 50 or 60 people, but the neighboring community has 2,000 cubic meters to harvest, you can't do anything with it on the economic front. And that's as far as it goes. It does not go down the line of co-management, it does not go down the line of planning and stewardship, and it does not go down the line with respect to future management and possible alternative uses. Some of the bigger First Nations have bigger allocations, but if you go to a community like Escanobinich or Elsipogtog, their allocations are 40,000 cubic meters. Still, so small compared to what some local contractors get. So communities cannot develop them into economically viable scenarios or businesses. The province does return the royalties collected off of those resources, because when the First Nation harvests the royalties, the industry claws back the royalties, clawbacks an overhead charge. The industry keeps an overhead for managing the ground, and the royalties go back to the province and then distributed among the communities based on the amount of wood that they harvested. Now those royalties, when forestry was great, like forestry was doing good prior to the first big, prior to the first crash in 2008, the royalties were high, but the royalties, the stumpage at that time was still only 85% of the fair market value. First Nations said, why ain't the royalties at 100% market value? And of course, because of the crash of the industry in 2008 and everything that was happening after that, the royalty model has changed. And so those royalties just kept continuously decreasing. And so how do you become part of a management system or a co-management system or any natural resource management structure, be it for the trees, be it for the wildlife, when you just don't have the resources? And this gets First Nations so frustrated, because one thing, I got nothing against industry in a lot of ways or in private loan, but I heard a statement just as I came in here to Health Canada from, I don't know the gentleman, I believe it was him, with respect to the economic viability of the natural resources, of how valuable they are to this province, that how much they contribute to this province. You know how much First Nation gets from the utilization of the resources on their land? Zero. Nothing. And I'll use with the exception of the little bit of money that comes from the royalties. And I'll give you an example. The Private Woodlot Association, they have their beef, of course, with first right of refusal and all this stuff under the Crown Land Forestry Act. But they do get a silviculture allotment every year to do silviculture management from the government of New Brunswick that I believe amounts to about $5 million a year to do silviculture management on their private land. Let me remind you all in here, these treaties were signed in 1725. There was no Irvins, very few settlers, very small private land ownership. And when that treaty was signed, it was signed 100% Atlantic region. But over a period of 150 years, you had more settlement coming in. You had more people coming in, and then land was just being taken. The story of Halifax in Cornwallis with respect to land just being taken to create the great cities that we have in the Atlantic region now. First Nation, under the treaties, was supposed to be informed. We're supposed to be made aware of those settlements, because Halifax was a prime moose habitat hunting area. And a lot of people ask you about this word about bury the hatchet, that they thought it was just some Indian phrase. But that was an actual event that happened in 1753, when finally one of the last covenant treaties were signed, where an actual musket and hatchet is buried. It's actually there. It's part of our treaties. It's part of our way of our history. But history, you know, so getting back to what I was, the private woodlot owners get $5 million a year, approximately, to do silviculture management. First Nations get nothing, zero. And all this revenue is generated from our land. And that's why First Nations talk about resource sharing. I remember one time sitting at a forestry conference in Bold Bay, and geez, I go way back, Premium McKenna. I'm 59 years old, so I go back a little ways. And I remember sitting down, and I said that time, I said, if one, and this was before the Thomas P. DePaul case, this was before a lot of things. And the Thomas P. DePaul case actually hurt some of the First Nations that were doing sustainable forest management objectives on their First Nations. Because our people never had access to cutting, timber. That it created issues even on our land. Because I said at that time when the Thomas P. DePaul case came out, I said 10 years too early. We're not ready. And look what happened. And if everybody knew how that broke down, how it got to 5%. McKenna resigned at that time. It was Finette and Camille Theriault were jostling back and forth. And initially, it was 10% of the AAC on the table by the province. And I was the only forester who was available to the Mi'kmaq people. They asked me to come in, and what did I thought? I said, take it, guys. You better take it. Because once everybody wakes up and shakes their head here, they're going to cut it. And of course, our communities were very happy simply because of the fact we had a win. And of course, the talk, we own it all, Steve. And I said, yes, I know we own it all. But we had nothing yesterday. Today, we could have 10%. Take it now as a starting point. And of course, 2 days later, 5% or nothing. Our communities are poor, so they signed. As soon as one signed, the rest just follow suit. And that created problems within our First Nations. So, it's very difficult to watch our land. And I'm just talking the forestry resource. You got mining, you got recreational hunts, you got all these other activities happening in our territory. And nobody, especially government, they do not look at the cumulative effect of all this activity on our traditional lands, of how it affects our communities. As a forester, I get so frustrated and so discouraged, sometimes even by the industry that I work in towards, because the first thing they said, well, my project ain't going to have effect, our project ain't going to have effect, but then the neighboring forestry operation, my project ain't going to have effect, and then neighboring maple sugar project, my ain't going to have effect. Put that all in the stew and stir it up. It has devastating effects on First Nation communities. And so to answer your question, we can't build our economies because it's just not enough.
All my questions. I thank you very much for your time and on short notice for coming today, and you really had a really powerful presentation. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Who's up next? Minister Holland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ginnish, for being here. Appreciate you closing out our week of presentations. We've got a lot of information in our heads today as it relates to a lot of important subjects this week. I said earlier that I'm at the point where if something new goes in one side, something old has to come out the other. We've gotten so much information. The only thing I want to say is that I appreciated listening to everything you were talking about, but there was probably nothing more impactful for me than when you said, let those little children's voices be heard. I just want to let my comments stop at the importance of what you said there as it relates to the tragedy that we've seen recently unfold. That has more significance for me right now than anything else. So that's where I'll leave my comments and defer time to other members of my team.
Thank you, Minister.
Holland. Anybody else? You? Yeah. Emily Hogan.
Thank you, Mr. Ginnish, for being here this afternoon. I, too, was shocked and saddened and horrified, and I remain that way, over the discovery of all the dead children. I cannot imagine the pain that your peoples are going through. I'm sorry personally for what has happened. I hope that moving forward, that we are able to truly uncover all the injustices and work towards reconciliation, which is going to take a long time. I thank you for your teachings today. I did not know that the forest was called the Wabanaki Forest. I knew of the Wabanaki Confederation. In your suggestion of doing a study in the Wabanaki Forest, I guess I wondered if the other 3 nations had been spoken with, or where they are in terms of wanting to move that forward. And I know that's just a small part of where we are today in terms of our indigenous history in our country and what we've learned to date. So you can choose the answer, the one about the Wabanaki Forest and the other 3 nations of the Wabanaki Confederation, or we'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
If I can just add a little bit, I personally, and I know a lot of my First Nations have been receiving a lot of sympathy and apologies, and I'm sorry, like remarks. Nobody in this room or nobody, standing today, in my opinion, need to apologize or need to say I'm sorry, but we do need acknowledgement as to what state, religion, and government has done to our people. We need that. And it's hard for myself, and I'm sure a lot of my elders, to see an institution that is the richest institution on the face of this earth. Some people refer to it as the city of gold. But yet there's supposed to be a structure of forgiveness and understanding and apologetic with respect to mankind or the human race as a whole. But you get nothing from them. In 1555, there was a statement made by then Pope, I think the native people got a soul. I know someday, whoever my creator is, I'm not going to be the only person that, if all our myths and beliefs are what they are and what we believe in, when I'm standing in front of whoever it is, whatever it is, I don't expect to be the only a First Nation person in front of them. I expect to be, a non-Indigenous person, a black person, a Hispanic, a Muslim, a Jew. Are we going to be in order of which we walk in, or are we going to walk in like this? That's what I don't understand, is how we can be so hard to each other on such a delicate planet. Is that if we don't take the lessons of what COVID has said to us, we don't have a right to stay on this planet any longer, in my opinion, because we do not treat Mother Earth with the respect it deserves. So I've been hearing a lot of stories, and I respect that, and I thank you for it. But it's nobody's fault in this room or in this province, in this land. But just the fact that there's an acknowledgement that this is being uncovered now in this country. It was a little frustrating that to see the province of New Brunswick not lower the flags for the children. I don't know if they ever did. I just kind of said, wow, really? These are children? We can't have respect for our children? It says a lot. And, Flavors of government changes on a regular basis. I hope something comes good out of this. I really hope something does, because First Nations are getting, we're so angry, we're so hurt, we're so disappointed. We are all treaty people. Society has to understand that. Your ancestors and my ancestors signed that treaty together. First Nations never had treaties signed among themselves because we lived in harmony for tens and tens of thousands of years. But we forged treaties with the arrival of, the French and the English, simply because we knew, our ancestors knew, if we're going to protect what we have to come to some type of understanding. And so we did. And to show the relationship between, at the time, one of the last treaties were signed, one of the last signatories to the Covenant treaties were signed on the Miramichi River, on the HMS Viper, between a governor representation, an admiral governor representation of King Edward III and King John Julian. King John Julian was titled king, but a king of Britain, because he seen the fact that he was standing and signing with his equal. And King John Julian was the chief of the Micmac tribe, the Miramichi tribe. And the Miramichi tribe are the communities you know today as Nagawaganek, Esconobadich, and Medamanagia, Eel Ground, Burnt Church, Red Bank. And those communities only became known once, only became the titles you hear today of Eel Ground, Burnt Church, or Red Bank, was because of colonialization. The herding of people onto reservations in order to control. So the history is so vital for us to educate our generations to come. But, to be treated equal partners on our own land, to have access to what government has when it comes, or industry has, with respect to management of our resources. That's all we ask for. The English or the non-Indigenous people would say piece of the pie. It's not what we're asking for. We're just asking to let us sit around the table so we can discuss who gets a piece of the pie. We're not even at that point in a lot of cases. We don't even get to sit around the table. But we have made headway with some sectors of industry, and it's only the start. But the biggest hurdle we see right now is forestry. Forestry and fisheries. You see the strides made in fisheries because the federal government is involved because of Marshall. You see very little activity in forestry because it's in the hands of provincial jurisdiction. But yet, forestry and fishery must adhere to Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. And, there's one thing, if there's one thing that comes out of these discussions today, is for First Nations to be given an answer as to why one of the biggest non-stop, continuous users of the forestry is not applicable to even an archaic EIA process. Why that does not happen is beyond me. And I just did some Emerald Ash board training last week, because here's another infringement, as I would see, to the Micmac culture, is that the black ash tree, very, very important cultural, significant, and spiritual tree species for our community. Here we have the commerce of this country bringing a beetle that came in through Detroit into Windsor, Canada. And I remember part of the First Nation Forestry program back in 2002 when I heard about this beetle. I said, oh my God, that beetle's going to wipe out our ash. It will make it to New Brunswick. And of course it's here. The beetle's here. And to hear during that training that a particular trees and that, and I knew all this, but also certain introducing other species, other wash to combat that, had to go through an EIA. Such a small aspect in the line of industry as a whole is applicable to an EIA. But all the activity around forestry, glyphosate, road building, cover infestation, tree diversity change, like all that, reintroduce monocultures, all that kind of stuff, is not applicable to an EIA. Why isn't it? I know my answer, and I know why. But when the 5% allocation came out for First Nations in New Brunswick was light years ahead of the rest of Canada at that time. And we thought there's going to be movement. Because no other jurisdiction in Canada actually had an allocation designated to First Nations. But they went nowheres. Now other jurisdictions of Canada, like you take BC for example, 25% of the AAC in BC is directed to First Nations. 25% of the AAC in BC is larger than New Brunswick's total allocation. You know, so why are we so stalled here in New Brunswick? And it's the same as you go the latest thing around issues, and you hear the Minister of Department of Aboriginal Affairs say that they're going to look at the Ontario royalty sharing agreements that they have with First Nations. I don't think New Brunswick is going to match what Ontario is doing with their First Nations, because I don't think New Brunswick is going to give 40% of the royalties that they collect to First Nations.
Thank you, Mr. Ginnish.
Yeah.
You still have some parting words. I didn't want to cut you off, but there's the time for question and answer part is expired a couple minutes ago, and I let you go a few minutes. If you want to have some parting words.
Thank you, sir. I just can't see the clock behind you.
I know I can't either. Half the time I got to look around, but anyway, just you got to take a second, have some parting words, and then we have a few things to go over because you're the last presenter for the day. Actually, before you start, I need to let you know, as well as the members of the committee, that discovery of unmarked graves at the former Maryville Residential School in Saskatchewan. Please be advised that flags at all provincial buildings, sites, establishments, and schools within the province of New Brunswick are to be lowered to half-mast until further notice, following the discovery of 751 unmarked graves at the former Maryville Residential School, in memory of thousands of children who were sent to residential schools, for those who never returned, and in honor of the families whose lives were forever changed. I just got that from the Office of Protocol. I thought I just might mention it while you're here. It happened not too long ago, so.
You know, it's amazing as Indigenous people that we survived. It's amazing. I just hope this country, this province, starts actually including First Nation when it comes to management, or it comes to bettering the society as a whole. That's all we want.